welcome to this explainer. Today, we're setting a slightly moody, cinematic tone because we're going exploring. We are going to unpack the fascinating psychology of the forgotten middle generation. We're talking about the folks born roughly between 1965 and 1980, Generation X. You know them. They're the older coworkers who literally never complain, the parents who might occasionally seem just a little bit detached, and oh yeah, the very people who actually built the internet. And yet, their psychology is probably the most misunderstood of any living generation.
So where is Generation X? That's a great question, isn't it? We talk endlessly about baby boomers and millennials. We dissect Generation Z like there's some fascinating new species we just discovered. But why do we completely ignore the generation sitting right there in the middle? Generation X just kind of exists, barely mentioned, and almost completely invisible in our daily cultural discourse. I mean, think about it. Boomers and millennials have this incredibly loud, highly analyzed cultural footprint. But Gen X, they have this uniquely silent existence. These are the people who will absolutely not post about their breakfast on social media. They keep to themselves. And to understand why this modern mystery exists, why they wear this invisible armor every single day, we have to go back to how they grew up.
Part 1. The Massive Latchkey Experiment.
I want you to transport yourself back to 1978 for a second. Picture being an 8-year-old kid, coming home to a dark, totally empty house because both your parents are working. Now, this wasn't just an isolated, rare experience. According to a study published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, by 1984, an astonishing 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. 7 million. That's a massive societal experiment.
And remember, this was the late 70s and early 80s. There were no smartphones, there were no Ring cameras on the front porch buzzing your mom's Apple Watch. There was absolutely no way for anyone to check if you were okay. You just let yourself in, made your own snack, did your homework totally alone, and waited. This environment forced an entire generation to be entirely self-reliant. They learned very early on that nobody was coming to check on them. You simply couldn't always count on someone being there.
Which brings us to Part 2, the high contingency brain.
What's really fascinating here is how all that alone time fundamentally rewired their developing minds into what psychologists call a high contingency environment. Because parents weren't hovering around to mediate every little squabble or mistake, when they finally did show up, you always knew exactly where you stood. The rules hit hard, they hit fast, and they were predictable. Nobody was pulling you aside to ask how you felt about your choices. If you stepped out of line, you paid for it right then and there. There was zero buffer time to negotiate the consequences.
Compare that to today. Today's buffered childhoods are full of constant supervision, softened consequences, and a whole lot of talking about feelings. But for Gen X, a high contingency childhood meant their brains actually learned to predict consequences in real time. Because they lacked that emotional buffer, their problem-solving and risk assessment centers were rewired entirely. It's exactly why Gen X tends to think 3 steps ahead in ways that completely baffle younger generations today.
Next up, Part 3, Irony and Defensive Pessimism.
If you trace this timeline, you see a generation that watched their parents talk a big game about stability, only to rack up soaring divorce rates in the 70s. At school, teachers were talking about nuclear annihilation during the Cold War like it was just a rainy Tuesday, making kids do duck and cover drills under wooden desks. Then, as they grew up, they watched incompetent authority figures fumble through Watergate, Iran-Contra, and the AIDS crisis. The youngest ones graduated right into the 2000 dot-com bubble burst, and the oldest hit their professional stride just in time for the 2008 financial crash. It was constant economic and cultural trauma, proving to them over and over again that absolutely nothing lasts.
Now, psychologists call this adaptive behavior, defensive pessimism, but Gen X just calls it being realistic. They cross their fingers for good things, sure, but deep down, they fully expect the rug to get pulled out. So they use irony as a shield. They'll crack a joke to keep things at arm's length before it has the chance to sting. And just look at their view on privacy. Growing up, if you messed up, maybe a few kids in a parking lot knew about it. Today, the idea of broadcasting their entire life to strangers on the internet feels incredibly risky to them. They learned early on that the fewer people who know about your business, the safer you are.
Moving to Part 4, Competence over Corporate Loyalty.
This quote really hits the nail on the head. Gen X watched their parents give everything to companies, only to get handed pink slips during massive rounds of corporate restructuring and layoffs. So they don't trust company loyalty, they trust their own skills. And those skills were honed in jobs that seem downright archaic to us now.
Think about a 12-year-old being solely responsible for an entire neighborhood's news on a 5 a.m. paper route, or calculating change in their head at a fast food register because the machine broke. They know they can't control if they'll be laid off, but they know they can control being the most valuable, competent person in the room. And this fierce self-reliance extended to how they actually acquired knowledge, too. Think about this contrast with modern instant gratification. Before the internet, knowledge had a physical weight and a real physical cost. You couldn't just Google it. You had to physically hunt through library card catalogs, spend hours locating one specific book, and then extract the answer yourself.
Cognitive psychologists describe this process as deeper encoding. Because learning required so much physical effort and time, that information became permanently integrated into their memory. It's the exact same reason they didn't call a technician when their bike chain slipped. They just flipped the bike upside down, got grease all over their hands, and figured it out. This built a really deep mechanical intuition and a lasting belief that, with enough patience and a screwdriver, they could master the physical world all by themselves.
But as you can see, this extreme self-reliance creates some fascinating paradoxes. They are fiercely independent, and yet they are quietly collaborative when a crisis hits. They're the ones showing up to help without making a dramatic post about it. They totally distrust authority figures who just have fancy titles, but they will follow actual earned competence anywhere. And here is a really critical finding from research in the Journal of Adult Development. While they are highly capable of handling a crisis, they report much lower levels of seeking social support during stressful times. It's not that they don't have friends, it's that asking for help genuinely feels like admitting defeat to them.
Which brings us to our final section, the silent bridge generation.
Gen X is now watching their kids grow up in a completely different world, one of constant supervision and endless social media documentation. And interestingly, they are raising their kids in total opposition to their own 1970s latchkey upbringing. They're giving their kids the constant attention they never received, which has inadvertently helped create a culture of helicopter parenting. But here's the catch. This deeply worries them, because in the Gen X worldview, being visible means being vulnerable. They carry this profound fear that by giving their kids all this support, they might be making them too soft and too dependent on others.
Ultimately, Generation X was shaped by a very unique moment in history. The old, analog past was dying, and the new digital future hadn't quite been born yet. They are the silent bridge generation. And let's be honest, bridges don't get much attention. They're just there, doing the heavy lifting, holding the whole thing together, and expecting absolutely no recognition in return. And honestly, not caring if anyone notices is probably the most Gen X trait of all.
Generation X might literally be the very last generation that truly understands what it means to be bored, to solve a complex problem without looking it up on a smartphone, and to feel perfectly fine sitting in an empty room. So I want to leave you with this to think about. As we move further and further into this hyper-connected, fully supervised modern world we've built, what exactly do we lose when a generation forgets how to simply... Welcome to the